I can see people coming in on Twitter, on Facebook. Welcome to everyone. Welcome on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. So good to have you. Thank you so much for joining us. Anna, people are calling me whilst I'm doing this, so we're not going to be taking any calls because we want to get on with the work. I see calls coming in on my phone. So just 1 minute. We're going to wait to make sure that no call comes in. So that we can just get on with the session. All right, just a minute. All right. Okay, so today we have a very important topic that we're talking about. I just want to make sure that we've got this on all set. Can we start? Okay.
Yeah, I'll start it.
All right. Just make sure that something like that. We just setting up. We lost connection on Twitter. I want to make sure that we start all of us all at the same time. So we're going to call anyone who knows me. Please don't call me at the moment. I'm in class. So I just forgotten to switch off my phone, and now we can start. Welcome on Facebook. Welcome everyone. It's such a pleasure to have you here today. We're talking today about Afrocentric research methodological design. And I've invited two colleagues who I really, really respect, Professor Spamandla Zondi from UP and Professor Shose Kesi from here at UCT, and I'll be talking to them later because I really, really think we'll benefit a lot from hearing from them. As I always do, I always bring in colleagues to talk with. The key question that we're dealing with here, or the key issue, is about conducting research in Africa, for Africa, and about Africa. And I'm focusing it that way because even if you're not in Africa, you're conducting research about Africa. It does matter what questions you ask, what methodological, what research design you're using. And so we're going to be talking to everyone who's conducting research about Africa. Whether they are in Africa or not is irrelevant. We're looking at everyone who's doing research or all research done in Africa, for Africa, or about Africa. We'll be asking a variety of questions. But the reason why we have this session is because Kea, who sent us a question last week through Twitter, asked us to talk about this. And I'm glad that Kea did that. And the issue is, perhaps we should start with why talk about Afrocentric research paradigms. Why? Why is it relevant? And the issue is that it's because the dominant research paradigms tend to position Africans not as key players, but as victims. Note that I say they tend to do that. Whether they're designed to do that or not, that's not what we're talking about. But this paradigm is really about saying, if we're going to do research on Africa, in Africa, about Africa, for Africa, we've got to understand Africa in all its being, its people, because how do you research something that you don't understand? All right? So Afrocentrism started in that way as a movement that seeks to conduct research and education on global history subjects from the perspective of historical African peoples. Right? So what does research look like when it is done from our perspective as Africans? What does it look like if it's done from our perspective? Note, Afrocentric research design. I mean, I've had so many messages since I posted this session, the notification for this session, that people said, oh yes, That's what I must listen to, that I must be up for that session because I'm doing research on black women in business, or I'm doing research on black students in township schools, or black students at university. And then it looks like people think you use Afrocentric research methodologies to find what's wrong with Africans, or it is only relevant if you're looking at black people, or it is only relevant when you want to find out what's the problem with black people. That's not the issue. Afrocentric research design or research methodologies are not about finding fault with Africa or anything African. They are not about finding fault with us. That people say, well, we want to find fault with the Africans, so we've got to use this methodology. That's not what it is about. So what is it about? And Professor Sipamandla and Professor Casey will talk to us more about that. But I've also received messages. So I've received messages from people who said, great, we like this because we're doing research on black women or whatever. Great. I've also received messages from people who say, but why are you doing this? Is this an attempt to minimize or trivialize work that emerged from other cultures? Is this an attempt of you to shade or minimize European, Eastern, Asian cultural influences in the work, in the scholarship, or in science? And some people have said, well, what are you trying to do? Is this a way of you trying to exaggerate the importance of Africa, or even certain aspects of Africa or being African? And I want to say that's not what this is about. This is not about minimizing any knowledge system. This is about saying the African. When we do research for Africa, about Africa, on Africa, we've got to ask ourselves, what is the perspective of the African? How are we positioning the African? It does matter. Because remember, when we started these sessions, we talked about the lens through which we do our research. We talked about doing your research proposal. Why do you do the study? How are you going to do it? What lens are you approaching or exploring the question that you're exploring? What lens are you using to explore the question that you're exploring? And sometimes it matters also, who are you in this question that you're exploring? It is not irrelevant. When I did my own research, which focused on my PhD research focusing on teaching and learning mathematics in multilingual classrooms, I foregrounded who I am because it was central to the questions that I'm asking, how I am asking them, how I was exploring them, and also how I was analyzing data. The fact that I can understand 9 languages mattered. It's an important issue. It's not irrelevant. And that's why I foregrounded who I am. Because if I didn't do that, it wouldn't make sense. When I start talking about data and I say that I'm analyzing it from the African perspective, I'm analyzing it from the source, I'm not analyzing a translated version, and then I go on to critique data, analyzing translated data. It wouldn't make sense in a way. So it does matter from which perspective, and that's why today in this session, which is part of our research design and methodology section, that's why it's important we are looking at African research, Afrocentric research paradigms. It is not trivial. But here's the thing. You as a student, you have a supervisor. When I started at the beginning, I said, you work with your supervisor. Your supervisor is your best support. So work with your supervisor. This session is not meant to make you defy your supervisor. It's meant to help you strengthen what you do. So work with your supervisor. Talk to them. I mean, if you would have invited them also to listen so that you can together work on the issues that we are talking about today, right? So work with your supervisor. Remember that your supervisor is your best support. So don't use this session to throw them out and then write to me and think that I can supervise you. No, I can't. Don't rubbish your supervisor because they haven't talked to you about Afrocentric research paradigms. Work with them. They are your greatest support, not only for your PhD or your master's, but for your career. So work with them. All these issues that we're talking about are a point of growth for many, and it is important that we work together in this regard. So be that kind of student who can work with your supervisor productively rather than come into the research group suddenly and try to say everyone else is not doing what should be and you are the one who knows what needs to be done. So, just now, I'm going to be calling Professor Siphamandla Zondi. He's going to be joining me on Instagram. I'm going to spending a lot of time with Professor Siphamandla Zondi, talking about Afrocentric research methodologies. We're going to unpack them. And what we're going to do afterwards, we're going to talk to Professor Casey. And then we're going to hone in on the issue of race. We know that race research or racialized research is big. I mean, I would be surprised in this country if it wasn't true that black people are the most researched in this country. I mean, I wish someone can do that and check. But black classrooms in this country are the most researched. They are the most researched. At the same time, black classrooms are the ones that where teaching and learning is not improving or learner achievement is not improving. Of course, debate for another day. But I can tell you that the most researched. And everyone who does research in black classrooms, in basic education, argues that their research is going to give us a solution, or it's going to help us come closer to the solution. Black learners are the most researched in our country, whether it's at university or at high school. So some people are raising questions about why, how, and so on. And I think those are legitimate questions. And so we're going to be talking to Professor Casey mainly about race research. What is race? Is it necessary? Who does race research? Does it matter how they do it? Should we be paying attention? How can we critique this? How can we make sure that it's productive rather than more polarizing? We know that race research was done during apartheid, and it served to polarize us. It says things about us as black people that others took as the truth and used against us and to inform their policies. So I want us to talk a little bit more about race, but first we're going to talk to Professor Siphamandla Zondi. Professor Siphamandla Zondi, I'm going to ask you that you join me on Insta. If you can ask me to welcome you on Instagram, I will click that button and get you in. But it will be great. Professor Siphamandla Zondi, of course, is a professor of politics at UP, University of Pretoria. He served as the head of department of politics at the University of Pretoria, and now he's a professor in there. Professor Siphamandla Zondi, Hlabisile, there I can see, go live. I found him. I'm waiting for Professor Siphamandla Zondi to join us. Siphamandla,
Hello, 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 hello. I am here.
Good.
Made it. Technology.
Why are we echoing today? I want to take my because I want to show colleague on Twitter can see you. Thank you so much for joining me. Can you talk to us more Afrocentric?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you very clear.
All right. And someone on Facebook will tell me if they can Facebook, Chiliti, let me hear Professor Samantha. Like the sound is here. Chilita, tell me that you can hear.
Yes, I can hear you very clearly.
Okay, great.
I hope I sound okay.
Sipamandla, where you are, there's echo, so I'm worried that the echo is a lot. What is it?
I wonder, should I use my headphone maybe?
Use your headphones. And we were not echoing before.
Phone next to you or any other.
Sipamandla, is there another?
How do I sound with a headphone on?
Ah, it's much better.
Pardon?
It's much better.
A headphone on, maybe that helps.
Perfect. It's perfect on my side.
Yes.
All right, Sipamandla, talk to us about the Afrocentric research methodological design.
Yes, thank you very much, and really thanks for this initiative. Thanks for inviting us to instigate a conversation about one very crucial option when students and researchers are undertaking research with Afrocentric methodology. I am conscious of the fact that everybody understands that research is a contested area. And that is why it's a knowledge generation or knowledge cultivation area. It's a contested thing. So I accept that even my views will also be contested, and that is how it should be. That's the beauty of it. Yes. Contested area. The second thing is, I am very aware also that knowledge is connected to power relations as well. Absolutely. And these are always present everywhere we do. Anyone who denies that and say they are not entangled in the power relations must be lying to us if they say so. And that is why research has a higher demand on my ethical choices than any area of my academic life. Because that is where I am required to deliberately humble myself, because research is implicated in its power relations as a researcher, in relation to informants, as a researcher, in relation to the things I choose, and as a researcher, in relation to the decisions I make about everything else. Simply because a researcher is the most important instrument in research, a researcher, therefore, has huge ethical implications to consider in everything that they do. Yeah. I know that we are taught to think about the research method as an important area. We think about the theory we're going to use as an important issue we need to be careful about. We need to think about the strategies for data analysis and data presentation, where we're going to publish work, whether we're going to convert it to commercializable implement are all important considerations. But throughout history, we now know that the most important of all the instruments of research is the researcher themselves.
Absolutely.
Quite often, what goes wrong with research isn't what happens in the lab or what happens on the field or what happens with the data. It's what choices the researcher made.
That's very profound. That's very profound.
Yeah. Yeah. And often what succeeds in research has to do with what ethics, what values, what approach, what calculations a researcher did, simply because information doesn't speak for itself. Data doesn't speak for itself. Data is given a voice by a researcher.
Amen.
And that is why then it is important for us to think about methodologies, because methodologies are both about how a researcher thinks about who they are in the research and how they think about the material that they deal with. And methodology is critical for that purpose, even this one that we talk about. So thank you very much for the opportunity. That was my introduction.
Beautiful.
Thank you very much for this.
Then, of course, at some stage we'll ask you, how do you, you know, the researcher, sometimes I say, is a key instrument in the research, but it's a key instrument that you don't pilot, you don't test, you don't know. It's regarded as benign, but it's actually not. It shapes what comes out in terms of data collection or even analysis, even writing. Whatever comes out of the research is key. But we don't actually, there's nobody who controls the researcher.
That's true. Because the researcher is central to the research process. He's the one who decides what goes in and what does not go in. I'm going to use two examples right through what I talk about. Say somebody was doing research in Makapanstad in the Northwest on water usage in that area. And or say somebody was looking at online marketing for new COVID drugs. It is in Centron and maybe also in Melbourne doing a comparative study. It is the researcher who chose water usage. And it's also a researcher who's going to choose what is water usage in Makapanstad.
Yes.
Whatever the people of Makapanstad think is water usage may not very matter that much, depending on what the researcher chooses what it is.
Yeah.
Perhaps working with a fellow researcher who is called a supervisor. Both of them must conspire to do that, and then they will submit their work to a research committee of fellow researchers. And take it to an ethics committee of fellow researchers. In the end, all of them will work and do quality assurance among each other and come to an agreement about what is the issue in Makapanstad that must be researched, which is called water usage. That is true. It's always going to be. But the manner it is designed is that the researcher who is conspiring all of those things is not under spotlight, neither in the proposal committee or in the ethics process. A lot of this, very little of it, is about the researcher and the choices they make and why they make their choices and whether they are self-aware about their back of the mind assumptions about their cultural location, about their own cultural biases and ethical choices that they are making. They are not challenged to do that. That's part of the challenge that we have right now. Which is why when you have research such as research controversy that have arisen in the recent past, a lot of them can all be reduced to the researcher and the choices they made, the assumptions they made concerning a matter that they needed to be sensitive about, but they still made them because the focus was more on the informants and the data than the researcher themselves. And the researcher is also likely to come back and arrogantly insist on their position as an unchallenged researcher and say to everybody, I am not the subject of conversation here, but my research is. It was approved. It was cleared. So I am okay. Because even after we've been signaled that we need to think about our positionality as a researcher, we are also trained as academics to be arrogant, not to step back and say, perhaps this means I could have done this differently. I could have done this differently. And again, that takes us back to the researcher. I use 6 questions about Afrocentric methodologies to instigate this debate quickly. The first one is, but the research methodology is just research methodology, because data is just data, because that research is just about finding answers to things. It's just it. It's universal. It's everywhere. It's just research. Why doesn't need to be Afrocentric? The responses that you often give to that is that we see in research what we choose.
Yes.
Or are chosen for us.
Yes.
What we see in research is what we choose, or what is chosen for us. That's very important. There.
And that's irrespective of whether you are in the laboratory, in a classroom, or in somewhere on the construction site. We see what.
That's true.
Absolutely.
That's true. Secondly, the choices we make are based on what is needed by particular communities to which we are loyal or to which we belong, irrespective of what our site of research may actually need.
Yeah.
So as a researcher going to Makapanstad or going to something on an online marketing thing, I'm very conscious of what my research community, where I come from, require of me when I go do that research. I may be more conscious of that than of what the people of Senti or the people of Makapanstad, where I'm doing research, actually need of me. There's power relations in there. The third point is literally everything we do is local. Everything we do is local and it's particular to somewhere.
Yes.
It's particular to the place and the site where we are researching, but it's also particular to where we ourselves are located. I can't divorce myself from the fact that I was born in South Africa. I was born on the rural side and went to a historically black university. And now I'm in a historically white university. And I'm a university person. I am those things are particular to me. Somebody who was born in the squatter camp and went to a historically white university and ended up working in a historically black university. We may have been born in the same period. There are particularities about us that are particular, very particular.
Absolutely.
So the universal, therefore, is often an attempt to impose on others what is particular elsewhere. The idea of a universal is actually about universalizing the particular. The universal is an attempt to hide the fact that I am particular, and the choices I make are particular. Where I'm thinking from is particular, and impose on others my particularity and make it universal. So the universal is a problematic because it often hides the particular and imposes on others. The fourth point is often we as Africans are invited to focus on digging up data, on creating experiments, packaging the data in findings, present it in validated assumptions, and do that in order to validate the theories from elsewhere, the assumptions from elsewhere, the myths from elsewhere, and the deceits from elsewhere. And the elsewhere is often the West. Because I must show that my research is of a quality acceptable in the universal. But universal is not everywhere. Universal is somewhere.
Yeah.
So we are then invited to use research that we do to validate importing knowledge that has been packaged somewhere. So just as African leaders are blamed of exporting gold and diamond for manufactured goods, we as African researchers can be blamed for exporting African data in order to validate a Belgian theory and confirm that it also works in Makapanstad. At that point, I'm not trying to find solutions for Makapanstad, but I'm trying to validate a theory from Belgium using data from Makapanstad. I am therefore to blame for the same thing that the neo-colonial leaders have done. I'm using research for neo-colonial ends. The second question that is often asked is, Afrocentric methodological design is not a thing in itself, but it's simply a reverse of Eurocentric designs, just like reverse racism is to racism. It's just a reactive mode. It is also an ethnocentric view. It is also a form of Eurocentrism from Africa. Then I say, The centrism in the two is fake. The centrism is a recognition that everybody speaks from some center. We always make choices from some center. We come to the world from some center. That's true. Secondly, the center means we are always centering certain lives, centering certain cultures, centering certain interests or interests of certain community. That is true. So both of them do the same thing. But they are fundamentally different in one way and in a significant way. That Eurocentrism is not about centering a perspective of Europe. No. It is about universalizing a center of Europe. That's problematic. If Eurocentrism was simply about projecting a European view of the world as an option of understanding what you say in McCarthy's stuff, it would be nothing wrong about it. If it was just about presenting a European perspective on online marketing for COVID trials, it would be nothing wrong about it. If you disagree with it, you will also have to provide your perspective. But Eurocentrism is not doing that. Eurocentrism is claiming that its view is the superior one.
Yes.
That its view is the scientific one.
Yes.
That its view is a universal one. And its view is an international one. The view you provide is a local one. The view you provide is a junior one. The view you provide is a inferior one. The view you provide is a area study one.
Yeah.
So Eurocentrism does not have to say a European view, but your view must say an African view, because your view is particular. The European one is universal. It's never declared. You never say, I'm coming from a Eurocentric view.
Let's wait. Let me challenge you here, because I agree with you completely. And I'm wondering how we as African unwittingly affirm
We produce
because even by calling this view Afrocentrism, we are also sidelining it. But then if we don't, then it gets judged by what is called universal, and then it again, in a way, it sort of becomes subordinate. So how do we, as Africans, make sure that what is African is not treated that way simply because we are calling it a different name?
That's a serious challenge. It is true that the fact that we have to name it an African view, an Afrocentric view, might contribute to cocooning it and make it a particularity that is out there, mainly because the European view never calls itself.
Yeah.
You read any book on anything, from physics to education to sociology to any field, an European view doesn't name itself. Because it wants to be known as international and therefore invisible to us.
Yes. Maybe we should name it.
That is why one of the best responses to do is to name ourselves.
Oh, yes.
Claim our own particularity and then name it as Eurocentric.
Absolutely.
In other words, expose it, pull the wool above it. So when somebody says, I'm using Marxism, Marxism is the best perspective on this field, I need to say to them, it's a beautiful theory. And it's very useful, but it has limitations of basing itself on a European experience. I'm naming it.
Absolutely. Yes.
I'm hating it because it doesn't want to be told that it is European.
Yes.
I must simply say it is progressive, or I must simply say it's radical.
Yes.
I must simply say it's a high standard, it's international.
Yes.
Because we use the word international often not to mean what the dictionary word international means. The dictionary word for international is nation, 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 nation. It represents nation, 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 nation. It includes the contribution of many. But international, you and I know that if I combine Angola and Namibia, and combine it even together with Jamaica, and maybe combine it with Bahamas, I would still not be international.
Yes. Yes.
Because that world is not international, even if it's many nations.
Yeah.
It must be international, even if it comes from one country, Belgium.
Yes.
International. So we will use those to do that. So it is true. We run a danger of cocooning it, depending on what motive we are using in saying Afrocentric. If we are using Afrocentric to claim we are superior to others, we are replicating the problem of Eurocentrism.
Yeah.
But also, if we are using anthropocentrism to say we want to monopolize our perspective on Africa, we want to withdraw from the world and go to Africa, we are then cocooning ourselves. But the reason why we are using Afrocentricity now, we are demanding that we want to speak to the world from our point of view. That's different from saying we are reducing, we are recoiling to a shell out of hate, and we want to speak only to ourselves, among ourselves.
Yeah. Spamandla, this is powerful. We can spend the whole day talking. The comments are great. The young people are appreciating your insights. Thank you very much for joining me in here. And what I'm going to do, I mean, maybe what we should end on is that question that comes from Aimami, who said,
yes,
how can one match Afrocentric designs in fields that are predominantly Eurocentric and almost non-existent or fairly new in Africa? I mean, the first assumption is that these fields are non-existent.
yes.
And that you have to merge African design. You know, so it's also that question centers the Eurocentric and sort of how can I patch my thing?
How do I enter?
Yeah, how do I enter? Because it's regarded as Eurocentric. Do you want to take that as a question so that I can go on to talk to Professor?
I fully believe that there is no field of study which is Eurocentric.
Yeah.
There isn't. I fully believe that there is no data which is Eurocentric. It is the methodologies that I use that are Eurocentric, but the field of study is not Eurocentric.
Yeah.
There's no discipline which is Eurocentric in itself, but it is the tools that I use that are Eurocentric. Now, if I say I want to do sociology because it's Eurocentric, what I'm meaning is this, that there are 80 people doing sociology, and 78 of them are doing from a Eurocentric view. I will not enter to add my Afrocentric view and challenge the current view, because the largest number of people who've entered are the ones I disagree with. It doesn't work like that in knowledge.
Yeah.
Going in to expose the fact that it has excluded Afrocentricity is itself a solution. Because remember, all research begins with what is called a research problem, which is one of the badly misunderstood terms in methodology. A research problem is not a problem. A research problem is the problem that there is shortage or inadequate coverage of an issue. So the very fact that this friend of ours has recognized that there has been a neglect of an African perspective on a particular issue, there is no use of an African paradigm or African ethics or African data of African case studies in that thing, it's a huge opportunity for them. Fantastic. Many students struggling, their PhDs fail before they even begin because they couldn't find a space. Where now you have seen a space, how lucky you are. Okay. You have seen it at the beginning. Why it will be at the end that your study would be called significant contribution to knowledge. Because you found a place where we're not present and you made yourself present. You are very lucky. It's a great opportunity. Go in there, expose Eurocentrism, and present an alternative. You are deepening conversation in that field. All studies have particularities, and your positionality is needed in that area too.
Fantastic, fantastic. Sipamandla will find another time to talk. This we must do for the whole hour. We'll find another time. Thank you so much for joining me. Really, really appreciate it.
You're welcome.
All right.
You're welcome.
All right, so that's Professor Sipamandla Zondi. Professor Sipamandla Zondi is Professor of Politics from University of Pretoria. Excellent insights that he brought. I'm going to be talking to Professor Shose Kesi, who I'm going to ask that if she's around, she can start asking to come in. Otherwise, I will call her in. I hope you got those insights from Professor Zondi. Knowledge is contested. So what we are sharing with you today doesn't necessarily mean you won't get someone critiquing it. This is a space of contestation. So when people disagree with what we say, that's how it should be. Professor Kesi, welcome. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much.
Great. And we can hear you. Of course, if the colleagues can hear you on Facebook, they will let me know. My friend, Professor Nenzelele Etunisa is there or holding up Facebook. He will tell me if we're not clear. And I'm watching here on Twitter. If there's anyone who can't hear, they will let us know. But
okay.
I want us to talk about race. You know, Professor Zondi, Sipamandla talked a lot about Afrocentrism, why it exists, the fact that Eurocentrism positions itself as universal knowledge, and that it's important that we name ourselves as Africans, center our knowledge, center who we are in the space, center our methodologies, but also name the other. But we know that we are in this world where we are the most researched, particularly in this continent. We are the exotic people who get researched, and so I wanted us to talk a little bit about race research, and you of course you do interesting work yourself in your area of study, and so I want you to tell us more about, should we be conducting race research? Should people be focusing on race research? First, maybe what is race research? What is race and what is race research?
Okay, yeah. So it was really interesting hearing Sipamandla, and I think I can make some of the connections between what he said and doing research on race, especially this idea of universality and how that's connected to, you know, the idea of science as objective, providing objective and neutral knowledge about the world, right? Which I think is a very European idea, but it has to do with the motivation behind the research. And when we're doing research on race, we need to understand what is race as a starting point. And it's very important to see race as a socially constructed phenomenon and not as a biological fact. And a lot of scientific research tries to kind of see race as something neutral and objective that exists out there, rather than something that's socially constructed. And the problem with seeing race as a biological fact is that it's a slippery slope, because we can end up seeing, essentializing racial categories. So we can end up with stereotypes about Black people are like this, white people are like this, and these are considered as facts, which is very problematic research. And we can see just from the history of race research how that has been created. A lot of the early 19th century research on race and intelligence testing, for example, and this happened in South Africa, but also in other parts of the world, race was treated as an independent variable, and different population groups were put through this type of intelligence testing, and the results of those studies show that Black people or Africans have the lowest intelligence, followed by coloreds and Indians and whites. So they created a hierarchy of race. And the problem is that the methodology behind these studies, or the scientific method, was not interrogated sufficiently. Particularly, there was no consideration of the cultural and social economic bias of the research and the social context in which people lived. There's this idea that we can just do this scientific experiments using race, and it's going to produce an accurate knowledge about differences between races. And this is how, like you mentioned in your introduction, based on these types of findings, it allowed the apartheid government to justify things like Bantu education, because if you have a whole category or whole race group that has low intelligence, then the answer for the apartheid state was Bantu education. But also, these types of studies produce particular stereotypes, and these things last. The science becomes common sense knowledge. It doesn't just stay scientific knowledge. And so when you have ideas about Black people being less intelligent, you can see these seep through different types of discourses around, Black students lowering the standards at, at a university, or all kinds of different types of stereotypical notions about Blacks being inferior and less intelligent. So these are really, seeing race as a social construct is really the starting point for doing any research on race. And then there's also a responsibility of the researcher to understand different terminologies. So here we use, we tend to use Black with a small b, that it signifies the inclusive sense of Black, or what students these days call Biko Black, the African colored Indian. Whereas in America, African American researchers tend to use Black with a big B, because it's a statement against, in opposition to the politics of whiteness. Other parts of the world might prefer to use people of color. So anytime you're doing research on race, you need to research these things and use the appropriate terminology. It's a very poor space, so it's important to do that. I can go on and stop me.
But here's the thing, Shose. Who should do research on race then? It's fine to know the different ways in which you can name it, but who should do it?
Look, I believe that people should research what they choose to research. We are free as researchers to research whatever we want. I don't think that's the issue here. But what Sipamanda was talking about before, our position in a research project needs to be interrogated. We need to be, reflect upon it. And something he said made me think about what I often tell my students, is that this academic knowledge that we're producing through research, it doesn't exist there somewhere for us to discover it. The knowledge that we're producing, we are producing it through the research project, right? So it's not that the knowledge that exists in the world and we come and we're trying to find it. So whatever we produce as researchers is the result of whatever study we are conducting. And so I think, it's really important for people to understand the positionality, of what it means for me, for instance, to do a project on whiteness and maybe interview white South Africans. How they respond to me and how they would respond to somebody else might be very different, because people are performing, they perform a version of themselves in the research project always. So it's just a matter of being aware and doing some reflexive work in a research project. I also think that, as it's such a sensitive area, anybody who does research on race has to use methodological rigor. They have to come with a sense of humility, so not coming from a position you know your results already, and you have to come to it with a certain degree of political conscience, because it's especially if you're doing research on racism, then it's a political space, and there needs to be some knowledge. So whatever research project somebody wants to get involved in, if I decide I want to understand, I don't know, the experience of Black rugby players in South Africa, I want to go out there and read everything that exists on that particular topic before before going into that research, because it will tell you something about what's already been done. Is there any gaps? Am I building on something, knowledge that exists, bringing something new? And maybe some of the mistakes I would have made would have been avoided because I became aware of research that's already been done. So it's really important to kind of do that groundwork and do a proper literature review, understanding the context, the topic, the players, the participants.
But Trusa, it seems to me that it's also important that you problematize yourself in that space. I mean, if I'm a woman, I'm going to be doing research on Black rugby players. What data I want to collect and how, and whether I'm with them there, and if I'm a white woman or a Black woman. I mean, it's not trivial. So we cannot pretend that the data that I'm collecting there is, it's just what it would be, even if it were collected by a white man, for example, or a Black man. So I think if you're doing race research or research on race, I think it's very important that you problematize yourself in the space that you are in, because it's not benign.
Yeah,
I guess it's also, Pamandla was saying, you, the researcher, has got you are a very important instrument, and so you shape what comes out of that data.
Absolutely. And not only that, I mean, there are different methods that you can use in research on race, on racism, that that help you deal with that problem of positionality, right? So if we look,
and you have done some of that. When we finish, I want you to share a little bit with us about some of the work that you've done. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
No, I was going to start by saying, attitudes research, for instance, it looks at, usually individual prejudice. And that's a very quantitative or experimental approach to research, where the researcher is designing the questions, designing the surveys, and goes out there and gets participants to answer a series of already designed questions. Now, the problem with that is that the researcher is coming with their own assumptions and ideas and cultural values and beliefs and putting that into the research. So if you imagine yourself as a participant and you're having to tick, agree, disagree, or there's no space for you to interrogate the questions. There's no space for you to say to the researcher, but why are you asking me that question? It's not really relevant. So attitude research can be very tricky when you're dealing with issues of racism. And then there's all this experimental research, and for instance, implicit association task, where the participants are shown a picture of somebody and they have to click next to the photograph. Photographs are paired with adjectives like good, bad, happy, and those types of experimental research, they're trying to look at people's unconscious bias. So if you click on the Black photo and associate it with a negative word, it shows your unconscious bias to Black people. So, and those could be, they're used a lot, for instance, in the police force and other institutions where you might want to show that people are prejudiced or that racism exists. So there's another area slightly tricky when you're doing research on race. And then there's the whole area of qualitative research. And what I do in my work is participatory action research. I use something called photo voice methods. And what is different about that is that the participants in the project become your co-researchers. So you're producing knowledge together. Qualitative approaches, you tend to come in there and ask very open-ended questions. You don't presume that somebody might define themselves as Black or they might define themselves a different way. So it's a approach to research that's much more, that allows for a lot more engagement, that makes assumptions. And particularly with photo voice, people are asked to take pictures and tell stories about their experiences. And so then I'm really shifting the voice away from me as the researcher and to the participant, to describe their own experiences in their own words, through their own photographs. Of course, I always have the final word, right? Because I'm going to interpret the data at the end of the day and write publications. But more recently, even I've included some of the participants in my research into writing publications as well. So we become co-author the whole process. And I think that really shifts the kind of power dynamics between researcher and participants, where we all become more co-researchers in the process. And that will avoid a lot of the dubious issues around doing race research.
Yes, yes. I mean, if many people who are doing race research were to work with the researched in that way, perhaps some of the mistakes can be avoided, because when you write with the I mean, I've done that where I write with the people that I collect data from their classrooms, but then I don't publish anything. Nothing goes published until they look at it and say, great, oh no, but can we write it this way? Can we do it that way? That deals with some of the challenges.
Yeah.
So we've got 3 minutes. I'm going to give you one of those minutes. If you were to give students advice who are looking at this, they want to do race research, what's the one key thing? You've said a lot of things and I'm sure they're taking notes, but the one thing, if they forget everything, that they should never forget, what's that one thing?
Wow. There's 3 things.
Yeah.
Approach your research with humility. I think that's the most important. Do not make any assumptions about what you know already. You've got to come in there wanting to learn and without preconceptions. It's very difficult to do. We all have preconceptions, but to understand that you have them and to reflect on them during the process of the research.
Instagram says we have 1 minute, 1.5 minutes. Quickly.
I'll leave it at that. I think that's a good way to end.
All right. Joseph, thank you very much for joining me today. Thank you very much. I'll talk to you again another time.
Great, thanks.
All righty. That was Professor Casey. And thank you very much to Professor Casey for joining us, to Professor Siphamandla Zondi for joining us. As you know, Instagram stops us in our tracks if we go on for too long. So Instagram says we've got 1 minute. So let me wrap up and say thank you. I hope you learned a lot. I mean, the big thing here is that you, the researcher, are the biggest part of the research. With all your being, it's important that you're ethical, it's important that you're humble, because you decide what questions to ask, how you're going to go about doing it, and what you write, how you write, where you publish it. So humility and working with the people that you are researching, and respect for the people you are researching is key. So as you get on with your study, and if you forget everything, please make sure that you don't forget those 2, so that you can get on with your study with the greatest humility and respect for the researched and the craft that you are involved in. Remember, what comes out of your research might end up shaping policy. and you don't want to mess up the world with your work. So all of the best for your studies. I'll see you next week, this time, same place on Sunday. Have a good week. Peace out.